Hello, this is Jamie Mitchell. We are back with another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have Megyn Kelly. Trump could drop a nuke and I'd still vote Republican, from MediaMatters.org, posted by Ninja Lover, and that's a cross post from the entertainment subreddit. And yeah, Media Matters is pretty much an open propaganda arm of the DNC, but I agree with the general message here that, people don't hold the major parties to account enough. A lot of people are going to still be voting Republican even after all the chaos with Trump. I think that's important to remember. And then you have all the vote blue no matter who DNC shills that Reddit has, and I think that's important to remember as well. In the end, I think the two major parties are just too ingrained into the American political system at this point. It's pretty much a given that in any given presidential election, 40% of the people are going to vote blue no matter who, and 40% of the people are going to vote red no matter who. And that just goes to show you, people have to hold the major parties to a higher standard, but sadly that's not the world we live in. We live in a world where the standard is ultimately what letter you have next to your name. If you have one of the major parties' letters next to your name, you can get away with a lot of bullshit that you couldn't if you had one of the minor parties' letters next to your names. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Iran cuts all diplomatic channels with the U.S. ahead of Trump's Strait of Hormuz deadline, from firstpost.com, posted by Ragnar OKXG. And yeah, personally, I think they shouldn't do that. They should be trying to negotiate peace. But ultimately, I would say the libertarian position is if a nation wants to cut all diplomatic channels with another nation, it should be able to. And ultimately, people are going to justify what they justify. Based on what position of authority they're in, and the government of Iran has every right to cut all diplomatic channels with the U.S. It feels like it. I personally think they should be trying to negotiate peace with the U.S., but regardless, ultimately, if they want to justify cutting all diplomatic channels, I think they should be able to as well. Next, we have, what would it actually take to invoke the 25th Amendment, from Gruffro, posted by Gruffro, and they said, prediction markets and online speculation have surged, but that is not the same thing as evidence that Section 4 is actually close. Even the Newsweek article driving a lot of the discussion notes that there is no indication that J.D. Vance or Trump's cabinet are interested in invoking the 25th Amendment. 1, you would need J.D. Vance to break with Trump. That alone is an enormous hurdle. 2, you would need the majority of the principal officers of the executive departments, which is usually understood as 5 of the 8 of the 15 cabinet secretaries, to join him. There is still legal ambiguity about whether acting secretaries would count, so the real pool could be narrower than people assume. 3, even now it would only be the beginning. If Trump contested the declaration, Congress would have up to 21 days to decide the issue, and it would take a 2/3 vote in both the House and Senate to keep Vance as acting president. Otherwise, Trump would resume office. That means Section 4 is not really a cabinet revolt mechanism. It is a vice president break plus a cabinet break plus a congressional supermajority. With that in mind, the real question is not just who might oppose Trump on Iran. The question is which Iran cabinet members have loyalties or institutional commitments as of Trump personally, and might therefore be imaginable in a genuine incapacity scenario. And they go over all the Congress members or the cabinet members that could break with Trump, and they say bottom line, the biggest obstacle is still not finding 8 people who dislike escalation. The biggest obstacle is finding J.D. Vance plus 8 cabinet secretaries who are willing to say Trump is actually able to discharge the office, and thus sustaining the claim through a 2/3 vote in both chambers of Congress. This is why most Section 4 scenarios are much weaker than they sound. They're usually really arguments for internal dissent, not arguments for constitutional incapacity. And I guess I would agree with all that. Ultimately, politics is mostly just theater. Trump's been acting like a schizo on social media for as long as I can remember. But it's it's gotten even really bad by even his standards as of recent. If the we gotta destroy an entire civilization truth, or the praise be to Allah truth. But, ultimately, I think it's all just theater. The president's mostly just a figurehead, and ultimately people have coped with Trump for a decade at this point, including 6 years in the White House, 4 in his first term, and we're on the second of his second term. And ultimately, I think, he did kind of the same stuff in his first term with the Fire and Fury post about North Korea. So it just goes to show you that, Trump, it's mostly just political theater and saber rattling on his part. He's not really the one really running the show, I would say. The president's mostly just a figurehead to distract from the deep state, who is the one really running the country. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Building a Libertarian Socialist Platform for President 2028, posted by Jacob Anders. And they said, I was raised on Ron Paul and Bernie Sanders. I'm now 35 and running for president against Gavin Newsom. Add, subtract, multiply, discuss. This is draft 1. And then they shared a bunch of their policy positions. They have housing as a human right. I personally would disagree with that one. You just can't declare something as a right just because you say it is. The same with food, just saying that food is a right doesn't necessarily make it a right, There might not be enough food for everyone. You have to produce food. Instead, you just can't declare it as a human right. And then we have Medicare for all. And I personally would be against that one too. I think if people want to have a government-funded healthcare, they should be able to. But I don't think they should be forced to pay for it if they don't want to. And the private sector does need to be an option as well if people want to choose that. Next, we have social ownership of automation. And I personally would disagree with that one. I think if people want to own automation, they should be able to. But ownership is ultimately going to be a personal thing rather than a social collectivist thing, and I think that's important to note as well. Then they have an anti-imperialist foreign policy. I would agree with that one. But ultimately, the U.S. government always does have to be involved in some of our country's affairs because it's very much the world police, whether people like it or not. Trump campaigned on ending foreign intervention, and so did Obama, and they just continued it. So it just goes to show you that you can say that we should have an anti-imperialist, anti-intervention foreign policy, but it's much easier said than done. Then they have reproductive justice and social care. And I personally think the libertarian position is if people want to pay for reproductive justice, well, let's see what they say. They said, we will codify the right to abortion and gender-affirming care as health care. Beyond paid leave, we demand universal child care and support for the care economy, ensuring that parenting and domestic labor are recognized as the essential work they are. And yeah, personally, I would agree if people want to get an abortion, they should be able to. And if people want to do gender-affirming care, they should be able to. Your body, your choice. I don't think children can consent to some stuff marketed as gender-affirming care, like double mastectomies and all that. But, that's on them. But I definitely disagree with the second part of that. Universal child care. If taxpayers want to pay for universal child care, I think they should be able to. But I don't think they should be forced to do so if they don't want to. And if people want to think parenting and domestic labor are recognized as essential work, they should be fine. That's fine. But I don't think people should be forced to view parenting and domestic labor as work, because ultimately work is very much a subjective thing a lot of the time, especially these days when you have all the work from home jobs and all that. It's much more of a subjective thing than I would say an objective thing, and it keeps getting more and more subjective by the year. And, if people want to pay parents for parenting their kids and all that, I think they should be able to. But I personally think the libertarian position is freedom of association. If you want to have kids, that's fine, but that doesn't entitle you to any additional benefits from the state, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have a Green New Deal for public power, and they said the climate crisis is a product of capitalism. We will socialize the energy grid, seizing the assets of fossil fuel giants to build a 100% clean public energy system. We will prioritize a just transition for workers and restore our soil for regenerative, community-led agriculture. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is if people want to invest in green energy, they should be able to, but if they don't want to invest in green energy, they shouldn't be forced to do so. Next, they have digital sovereignty and data rights. And they said data is the new oil and it belongs to you. We will implement a digital bill of rights to stop corporate surveillance and treat the internet as a public utility. High-speed fiber must be publicly owned, free at the point of service. And I would disagree with. I'd agree that digital sovereignty is important, but I don't think everything should be publicly owned and free. I think that's more socialist and libertarian. That's my big problem with a lot of these libertarian socialist types. That 99% of them put the socialist before the libertarian. This guy seems to be one of those types. And they have a few other policy positions. I think I'm gonna skip over them and move on to the next post. But yeah, ultimately, I probably disagree with this guy on a bit, but he's definitely probably better than a corporate Democrat like Gavin Newsom. But that being said, it's just gonna be. A lot of, as I said, a lot of libertarians, quote-unquote libertarian socialists, are much more socialist libertarians. They put the socialist before the libertarian 99 times out of 100. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Who's to blame? What's to blame for Cuba's reversal of fortunes after the revolution in 1959? New research investigates, posted by Lemon Limelight, and they said, before the revolution in 1959, Cuba was one of the most advanced and successful countries in Latin America. Today, the UN World Food Program, which is more accustomed to feeding off starvation in Africa, supports well over a million Cubans. When the Communist Front government cuts the weight of its daily bread ration, it blames the U.S. trade embargo. According to fellow travelers, most Cubans on the island spent their entire lives enduring shortages caused by decisions taken in Washington. Even center-right columnists say Cuba's economy, thanks in large measure to the long-standing U.S. embargo, has long been in shambles. But does the embargo really deserve so much blame? According to a new working paper which states Cuba's economic decline after 1959, emphasis added, the embargo here hurt, but it was the secondary importance of explaining Cuba's reversal of fortune. The massive decline in Cuban economic performance can be primarily attributed to the transition to socialism rather than external foreign policy. Very briefly, the researchers compared economic performance between actual Cuba to synthetic Cuba, a counterfactual constructed from similar economies, because synthetic Cuba didn't experience a regime change or an embargo. They can measure the effect of those events. The time of Cuba's reversal of fortunes is clear, and in Cuba in 1989, adjusted for data quality issues and net of Soviet aid, significantly underperformed synthetic Cuba. I guess they share a link to that study. And then they add, and after investigating the effects of the embargo, the researchers find that it only explains around 3 to 8% of the economic performance gap, a trivial part, and the lion's share of the observed divergence is therefore attributable to the policy regime implemented following the revolution, i.e. the transition to socialism. And I would agree with all that, just because socialism might sound good in theory doesn't mean it works in practice, and Cuba is a good example of that. Whenever you mention that socialist logo, they always say, oh, it's a U.S. embargo, and ultimately, I think, any embargoes do go against free trade, but I think it's interesting that, a socialist-run country needs to trade with one of the biggest capitalist-run countries, or else its economy won't work, and that just goes to show you that socialism doesn't work. If socialists, they'll say, what about the Nordic states? And even the Nordic states, they're much more capitalist than they are socialists, arguably, and that's important to remember. Every time communism's been tried, like of Cuba or the Soviet Union, it always fails. I think that's important to remember. Even to the communist countries of today, like the People's Republic of China, are much more capitalist with communist characteristics, I would say, than actually communist. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have a look at how the Epstein files dogged Pam Bondi's time as Attorney General from PBS.org, posted by The Way to Beauty. And yeah, personally, I don't really, ultimately, if people want to keep talking about the Epstein files, I think they should be able to do so. But, eventually people will move on to the next current thing. A lot much more people are talking about Iran these days, than there are the Epstein files. It's very much, people always talk about whatever the thing that drives the most engagement on social media is. And I think, people can talk about the Epstein files as much as they want to, but it's very much like the Panama Papers from 10 years ago. Ultimately no one will be held accountable. Maybe a fall guy here or there, but basically no one. And the elite class will continue as it always has. Next, we have facts posted by Ragnar OKXP, and that's a meme that they shared. It looks like something from @DeepNotShallow, who said, if we survive Trump, Dems will run up huge numbers in 2026, 28, like 2006, 2008. But if the next president doesn't govern like FDR, broad reforms, corruption prosecutions, and landmark legislation, we end up right back here. Winning isn't enough. Dems have to change things. And yeah, personally, I guess I would kind of agree with that. I personally don't really care for FDR. He's pretty much like the left-wing version of Trump. Either him or LBJ, I would say. But, ultimately, the libertarian position is, if Dems want to have all this authoritarian legislation, that's fine. But, I personally don't care for authoritarianism, whether it's painted red or blue, and I think that's important to remember. A lot of people bitching about the government authoritarianism right now, who are going to all the No Kings protests and circle jerking themselves on Reddit constantly about it, they're completely fine with authoritarianism when it's in blue. I think that's important to remember as well. These people don't have any principles, only teams. They love blue Trump. They love a woke socialist version of Trump, and I think that's important to remember as well. Ultimately, a lot of people just want a dictator they agree with, and Reddit's definitely not an exception on that front, I would say. Ultimately, I would say, the libertarian position is we gotta stand up to both blue and red authoritarianism, regardless of which branch of the uniparty is in power, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Viktor Orban and his American apologists all deserve to lose. Posted from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I would agree with that. I personally don't really care for Viktor Orban, but ultimately, if people want to keep re-electing him, I think 16 years is a bit long for us to be in power, and we also think he was in power back in the had a term from 98 to 02 but ultimately, people can keep electing him as much as they want. It just goes to show you that democracy is kind of inherently anti-libertarian. You can get a society that justifies voting in authoritarians for as many terms as they want, as long as the democratic election says so. And that's personally why I think the libertarian perspective, as I've said numerous times, is much more for voluntary collectivism than forced collectivism. I think if people want to have voluntary collectives and appoint people like Viktor Orban to run them, I think that's fine. But when you go to get on the country level, I don't think appointing someone like Viktor Orban to run the country for 16 years isn't very libertarian. But ultimately, people are going to justify what they justify, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Ron DeSantis clamps down on free speech in the name of fighting terror from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for a lot of, there is a lot of edgy speech that's kind of I guess you could describe it as stochastic terrorism. I saw a post on the comic subreddit recently. It's like, we need to shoot Nazis in Wolfenstein 3D. And of course, everyone on the left says that anyone who's a disagreement with it all is a Nazi. So that might lead to some violent speech, but ultimately I would say all speech is inherently free speech. If you want to say let's as long as you don't get your hands dirty, you should be able to say whatever you want to. I guess you might have some French cases where maybe if you're harassing someone 24/7 that it should be illegal, but ultimately I think the libertarian objective is you gotta support free speech regardless of how much you disagree with it or not. If people are gonna say that we need to take out all the Trump supporters and throw them into re-education camps. I personally don't think that's libertarian. I personally don't care for Trump, but I don't think we should have re-education camps. But ultimately, people should be able to say whatever they want to, and that's very much a libertarian position. The libertarian market is for a free market of ideas, and you can't have a free market of ideas without fully freedoms of speech. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have libertarians that support Citizens United. How do we get IPAC money out of politics if we not get rid of Citizens United? Posted by Ragnar Okeshti, and they added, because if it wasn't for Citizens United, IPAC and other super PACs would be severely limited in the amount of money they can funnel into their preferred politicians. And yeah, personally, I think Citizens United is mostly a speech thing. I don't really care for IPAC. I think they're one of the most powerful special interest groups in lobbies in a city full of them. But regardless, they have every right to spend to throw as much money at what they want as politicians as they want. I personally think the libertarian position is if you don't like them throwing money at politicians, just don't vote for the politicians that they throw money and accept money from them. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Pam Bondi will not appear for her upcoming deposition in the House Oversight Committee's Jeffrey Epstein investigation now that she is no longer serving as the U.S. Attorney General, the Department of Justice said, posted by Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the Moss subreddit. And yeah, and it looks like an article from CNN about that. And yeah, personally, if the Department of Justice doesn't want to send her there, ultimately, sometimes, people, if they don't want to do something, they're not going to do it, even if there might be a subpoena. Ultimately, all congressional subpoenas are ultimately, it doesn't matter who the Congress issues the subpoena to, it matters how it's enforced. If someone doesn't want to testify before Congress and they don't want to, and they don't feel like it, and the government doesn't have the force, doesn't want to justify using force against them, ultimately, then they're not going to testify before Congress, and sometimes you just have to cope with that. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. If people wanted to testify, they should be able to, but they shouldn't be forced to testify if they don't want to. Next, we have automatic registration for U.S. military draft to begin in December, from thehill.com, posted by Jolly Porcupine. And I responded to this post on the anarcho-capitalism subreddit because I can't comment on this subreddit because, they banned me despite claiming to be uncensored. It's very interesting, Reddit loves, they mark themselves as loving freedom of speech, but, then you say you do a wrong thing and suddenly it's they worship the god of censorship. But anyway, I said, yeah, it's nothing new. I'm pretty sure I had to do it even though I can't serve due to medical issues. Like the vast majority of the people in the military age range these days, I can't join the military even if I wanted to. And yeah, personally, I think if they want to have automatic registration for the draft, I think they should be able to, because ultimately, a lot of people are already forced to. Well, a lot of men, I should say, women aren't forced to register for the draft, but men, even if they can't serve, like myself, are forced to register for the draft, even if they don't want to. So I think at the very least, making the registration automatic probably is something that makes it a little easier, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have first KY04 poll. Massey has lead, not majority, over Trump-endorsed Galrain from amp.kentucky.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, hopefully, I hope Massey can pull it out. But if he doesn't, it's just a good argument for why libertarians should be against democracy. Just because someone votes for something doesn't make it good, and that's very much what democracy is. It's very much mob rule and tyranny of the majority. Occasionally you get some good people through it, like Thomas Massey, but he's much more the exception rather than the rule, I would say. And that's my thoughts there. And then I did a post on the Libertarian Party USA server I want to share as well. Let's rank the 48 countries that have qualified for this year's FIFA World Cup for most least libertarian. And yeah, since we're already running kind of long on time here, I'm not going to share the full list. I have it on my Twitter feed if anyone wants to check it out. But so I did post that as well. And I have to see if there's anything new on the Libertarian Censored subreddit. It looks like we have a new post. Trump versus Second Amendment. The administration is trying to selectively apply gun rights from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I think the Second Amendment, it shall not be infringed. And, ultimately, I don't really care for Trump. I think he's very much a gun grabber who markets himself as a gun person, just like a lot of Republicans. But that being said, the Democrats are almost always usually worse on the Second Amendment than Republicans are. I think that's important to remember as well. So I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.